and Angela will be talking about Spiders in the Spotlight, a global assessment of news coverage on spiders and spider bites. Take it.
Folks, I'm Angela Chuang. Hopefully you all can hear me. So I'm presenting a project led by Stefano Momola on global trends of spider coverage in the news and on behalf of many of our collaborators. And so most of us are steeped in media on a daily basis at this point, and the increasing publication and availability of news online means that news can be shared faster and more easily than ever before. And while this can have the positive effect of connecting us to global events, there's also the potential for misinformation to spread faster and sometimes to become viral. And this can be an issue when we think about the intersection between media and spiders, since arachnophobia is common and a widespread phenomenon, as Freddie mentioned before. And as feared animals, spiders make good clickbait content. And as previous research on Italian news showed, news on spiders can oftentimes be sensationalist, rely on fear-mongering, and contribute to negative public sentiments on spiders, all of which can distort the perception of risks associated with them. And so here's just kind of a smattering of examples of, like newspaper headlines we might have come across in the past if you've ever read something about spiders. This one says, "This giant spider literally ate a possum and the photos will haunt your dreams." And sometimes the news in question isn't really even representing a conflict between humans and spiders or spiders and other animals. And even something as innocent as, spiders emerging from an egg sac can merit this incredibly ungenerous title. There's nightmares, then there's this video of Aussie funnel web spiders hatching. And unfortunately, there's a slew of misinformation out there in the public that leads people to misattribute various skin conditions, injuries, or arthropod bites to spiders. And so you see these really sad stories like, "I went into jail with 2 feet, I came out with 1.5 feet. And so this obviously stirs up a lot of fears about spiders. Similarly, "I slept through 7 white-tailed spider bites, but the pain will last forever." And so this kind of misattribution can really in turn feedback and worsen the public image of spiders. And so for this project, we were motivated to understand global trends of spider news coverage with a focus on determining when and where purported spider bites occur, whether news articles are accurate in their descriptions of spiders, and the extent to which they consult experts like doctors or arachnologists, where we suspected, reporters that are able to talk to professionals that know something about spiders and spider bites might end up reporting fewer errors. And so today I'm just presenting some of the preliminary trends from this project. And so you might have noticed on the title slide that there was an asterisk in our list of co-authors, and that's simply because we have about 65 collaborators working on this project. And so everyone's been very generously reviewing news articles in their respective regions and in their languages. And so altogether, we were able to evaluate about 6,200 news articles from 6 different continents in 41 different languages listed here. So in order to collect our data, we use standardized searches through the news function in Google. So each person typed in a couple of different phrases and then restricted the search from the years 2010 to 2020. So actually in 2020, we only did it up to May 2020 because that's when we started this project. And so the types of phrases we would type in included spider bite, spider sting, because in a lot of different languages, people use this kind of interchangeably and it's a common misconception. And we also replaced the word spider with the names of kind of common spiders we expected to be in the news. So things like black widow bite, brown recluse bite, tarantula bite, and so forth. So our criteria for including news articles in our analyses was that it should actually come from a newspaper or a magazine. And so we essentially excluded anything that was like a blog post or a forum post. We were also only interested in articles that pertain to a human spider encounter. So unfortunately, we had to exclude all the Spider-Man articles, anything reporting like spider research or hypothetical articles. So things that said, what should you do if you get bitten by a spider? And so we ultimately cast a pretty broad net on the types of articles we were interested in reading and evaluating. But we did pay special interest to news on spider bites. And so in the data I'm about to show in a bit, do note that we're talking about purported spider bites and supposed cases where people had died from a spider bite. So we didn't actually, in this data set, we didn't try to distinguish between cases where we thought it was like a misdiagnosis. So this is what we found. This figure here shows the frequency of unique news events over the span of the last decade, color-coded by the type of news event that it was. And so overall, we see this kind of very clear pattern of an increase in spider news over time, which could indicate just a general interest in using spiders as subjects of news. This could point to cases where like initial reports on spider bites lead to a lot of interest, a lot of hysteria in some cases, and then like a lot of subsequent articles on them, as I'll mention in a case study of Steatoda in just a bit. But we also know realistically, like some of the earlier years have very few news compared to like later years. And so this is probably because we were searching on Google. And so, you know, links break over time and some of these older articles might not have been archived accordingly. So this is showing the temporal trends where we were looking at which month our news articles were written in. And so you'll notice there isn't really a discernible pattern in the Southern Hemisphere, but in the Northern Hemisphere, we're certainly seeing a lot more articles on spiders in the later summer months and a lot fewer in colder months. And so we think this kind of roughly matches like the seasonality of spiders. Here, I just pulled the seasonality graph for the Western black widow off of iNaturalist, which also shows, you know, when other people are encountering and photographing this spider. And you can kind of see, you know, it does roughly correlate. And so that's kind of cool. Here we've just plotted the localities of all of our different spider news events. And maybe unsurprisingly, we see like a strong bias of a lot of events that are occurring in countries north of the equator. So we don't necessarily think this means that there are actually more human spider encounters here. But again, this is probably like a bias in how in kind of population density, newspaper outlet density, etc. And just kind of like a general bias of us finding more news from North America and Europe via Google. And so here we show the frequency of news coverage by spider genus. And so our hypothesis here was that we would probably find more coverage on spiders that have medically important bites. And so these genera are indicated with that arrow up above. And I think to some extent we did find this, right? So our recluse and widow spiders in the general Loxosceles and Latrodectus respectively were the ones that were most represented. But I do think it's kind of interesting, like if you look on the left-hand side at that others bar, we had like 80 genera there. So in total, with our like 6,200 articles, we were still finding about, you know, coverage of about 100 different spider genera. And I thought interestingly, we found that Steatoda spiders are kind of our third most covered group. And if we wanted to explain this trend, I'd really have to shine a spotlight on news from the UK and our collaborator, Richard Pierce, who just really heroically scored about 800 articles by himself on his country. And so we found that a lot of the 800 articles from the UK were featuring Steatoda nobilis. And they portray the spider as like a deadly spider, which is, you know, not true. And so we believe this is a case where this spider has basically become a scapegoat. When people, you know, develop skin issues, if they get injured in some way and have necrosis, a lot of times they seem to think it's this spider. And so it's this kind of vicious cycle where the media is like reporting, you know, in the summer these days, like that they're getting these invasions of deadly spiders. And then of course, when people encounter some sort of strange skin rash or whatever else that oftentimes results in hospitalizations, they also think it's due to this spider. And so Richard really noted that, you know, in these articles that villainized Steatoda nobilis and claim that it's responsible for all these issues, these articles like generally lack any sort of evidence of even just spider involvement, let alone these issues being due to this specific species.
We're at 10 minutes.
Okay, and so these issues were like perpetuating falsehoods really do echo what we ended up finding when we scored the newspaper articles on their accuracy with regards to spider taxonomy, anatomy, natural history, and venom. And so here we've just pulled that data to kind of show you very roughly, and we're just comparing articles that were error-free, according to the arachnologists that read through these articles, versus those that had at least one type of error that we could identify. And so we found that about 45% of all of our articles around the world had at least one type of spider-related error, which just seems like a lot. And we think part of this may be due to a low rate of consulting experts in these articles, where we found only about a little more than a third of these articles did that, with of course a bit of regional variation. And so when I talk about experts being consulted, again here, we have pooled the different categories of experts that we were looking at, where we had considered medical professionals like doctors, nurses, even like hospital officials. We considered arachnologists and entomologists. And then in our other category, we included all sorts of like wildlife experts, and as well as like pest control officials. And so even then, only like about 38% of the articles bothered to interview someone kind of knowledgeable about these topics. And then of course, if we wanted to look at the data for the number of articles that had quotes or consulted an arachnologist or an entomologist, then that number drops even more. And so we see about only 19% of the articles feature an arachnologist or an entomologist. And again, this can help explain why there were just simply so many errors on spiders that proliferated through the articles that we read. So in conclusion, we found that spider news commonly contains some sort of error on spiders. And this perhaps points to a need to develop better open access resources online for journalists that might be searching for basic information on spiders. So kind of anecdotally from the data set that I processed, I did notice that a lot of articles kind of contain similar types of wording or information, where I could tell, they were going to the same National Geographic website to just like be able to say something about the spider in question. And so our group has discussed the possibility of maybe writing a guide for journalists that addresses these types of common misconceptions that we saw in articles. Things like a really common taxonomic error that we saw was just like calling spiders insects, right? I find that our results also highlight the importance of public outreach that arachnologists engage in, since it seems pretty clear that the public is exposed to a lot of media coverage on spiders that's oftentimes not factually accurate and may even serve to fearmonger people instead. And of course, we do care about like this negative representation of spiders because it can result in their deprioritization of like their well-being and conservation, which of course matters a lot in this like age of global change. And lastly, I do want to mention that our goal with this project is to make this data available in an open access database. So anyone can access these articles at some point. And so if you are really curious about this project, or if you're kind of wondering like, oh, did you explore these trends? And what about this and that in these articles? Then we very much invite you to explore it yourself at some point. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions if there is time.
Okay, yeah, that was great. Thanks so much. You've got lots of questions already, Angela. Let me start here. Do you think people staying in their house more because of the pandemic is making them more aware of spiders they have at home?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. I know I've certainly cataloged a lot more spiders in my dwelling. Yeah.
Okay, and do you think, as to the northern hemisphere bias, do you think it suggests that fear of spiders is more common in these regions than in the southern hemisphere?
We had a lot of like discussion on where those patterns were coming from. And I think part of it was, we do this like northern versus southern hemisphere thing. And maybe it could be, I don't know if it would be more informative if we like tried to look at like just the tropics versus the non-tropics. Like actually thinking about biologically relevant ways to separate the data based off of actual seasons.
Mhm.
Stefano thought that, at least for Italy and perhaps Europe, he said that maybe there were more articles in the summer because that's when a lot of people go on holiday and a lot of the news kind of slows down. And so these news outlets are like looking for kind of anything else interesting to publish. And so they'll latch onto like small local stories about spider bites.
And let me just add one more, and there's several more you can address yourself, but do you think internet access may be part of the bias of the country of origin of the news? So do you think there's an internet bias relative to the spider reporting here?
So do you think
internet access?
Yeah, so countries that have more internet access are more likely to, sorry, can you say that question again?
Well, I guess, do you think internet access may be part of the bias of the country of origin of the news? Is the access to internet affecting the bias in the
I think so, yeah. I mean, it should impact whether the news is online in the first place. I would mention that like in some countries, we simply didn't find any news. And I know for at least one of the countries, the authors actually went to the newspapers that were just printing articles and weren't online yet. And they contacted like all 12 newspaper outlets in their country, but then they confirmed that there were just simply no articles on spiders in their country, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I do think there's probably some sort of bias in terms of what's actually put online. Yeah. In that case.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to